Lucas had always been an outdoor enthusiast. He'd spent countless weekends camping, hiking, and exploring nature. So, when his friends suggested a weekend camping trip in Blackwood Forest, he eagerly agreed. The forest was known for its vast, untouched wilderness, and though there were rumors of it being haunted, Lucas didn't believe in such things. The first night at the campsite was normal enough. Lucas and his friends set up their tents, built a fire, and enjoyed a night of storytelling and laughter. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling brightly above the canopy of trees. But as the night deepened and the fire began to die down, the forest around them seemed to change. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in from the treeline, muffling the sounds of the woods. "Did you hear that?" Jake, one of Lucas's friends, asked suddenly, his face turning pale. Everyone fell silent, listening. At first, it was nothing, just the usual sounds of nature. But then Lucas heard it too. A faint whispering carried on the wind, so soft it was almost imperceptible. "Probably just the wind," Lucas said, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over the group. But something in the tone of the whispering felt off. It didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like voices. Trying to keep the mood light, they all decided to call it a night. Lucas crawled into his tent and zipped up the door, cocooning himself in his sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. The whispering seemed to grow louder, more persistent, as if it was circling the campsite. Every time he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear faint voices just outside his tent. Around 3 a.m., Lucas awoke to a cold sensation on his skin. His tent flap was open. He sat up quickly, heart pounding, wondering if one of his friends had played a prank on him. But as he scanned the area, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Just beyond the dying embers of the campfire, in the thick fog, stood several shadowy figures. They were still, unmoving, watching. Lucas blinked, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination playing tricks in the dark. But when he opened his eyes again, the figures were closer, now just at the edge of the campsite. Their shapes were human-like, but something was terribly wrong. They had no faces, just dark, featureless voids where eyes and mouths should have been. Panicked, Lucas scrambled out of his tent and ran to wake his friends. But as he shook them awake, they didn't seem to see what he was seeing. The shadows were gone. "You're probably just dreaming, man," Jake mumbled groggily before falling back to sleep. But Lucas knew what he had seen. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, he sat by the fire for the rest of the night, poking at the embers to keep it alive. The shadows didn't return, but the whispering never stopped. The next morning, Lucas told the group about what he had seen. They laughed it off, blaming it on the spooky atmosphere and the ghost stories they'd been telling the night before. But Lucas couldn't shake the image of those faceless figures. Determined to prove he wasn't crazy, he suggested they explore deeper into the woods that day. As they ventured further from camp, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The deeper they went, the thicker the fog became. Lucas's unease grew with every step. Eventually, they came across an old abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked ancient, its wood rotting and covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Something about the cabin felt wrong, as if it didn't belong there, as if it had been forgotten by time. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to explore inside. The air inside the cabin was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under their weight. Old, decaying furniture lay scattered about, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. But what really caught Lucas's attention was the large mirror hanging on the far wall. It was cracked, its surface grimy with age, but there was something off about it. As Lucas approached the mirror, he noticed something strange. His reflection wasn't quite right. It moved slower than he did, its eyes staring back with a twisted grin. Startled, Lucas stumbled backward, but in the mirror, his reflection remained standing, its grin widening unnaturally. Suddenly, the reflection began to move on its own. Lucas's heart raced as he watched his reflection step forward, out of the mirror's frame. His friends hadn't noticed yet. They were busy exploring the rest of the cabin, but Lucas couldn't tear his eyes away. Lucas turned and ran, shouting for his friends to follow. They sprinted out of the cabin, back into the fog-shrouded forest. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, coming from every direction. "Come back to the woods!" They didn't stop running until they reached the campsite, breathless and terrified. The shadows were waiting for them. Dozens of faceless figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their dark forms barely visible through the thick fog. "We need to get out of here," Lucas said, his voice shaking. They packed up their gear in record time and left the campsite, heading back toward the road. But the shadows followed. Every time Lucas looked back, they were closer, their dark forms blending into the fog, but always watching. By the time they reached the car, the whispering had become deafening. "Come back to the woods. Come back to us." They drove away as fast as they could, the fog swallowing the road behind them. But even as they left the forest behind, Lucas knew that the shadows weren't gone. They had followed him, attached themselves to him, whispering in the back of his mind. And he knew, deep down, that one day they would come for him again.